Hello everybody and welcome to this video. My name is Laszlo and today I'm going to show you how I service the primary and secondary air filters on my 2020 Suzuki DR650. If you'd like to follow along, here are some of the tools I'll be using. A Phillips head screwdriver, a 12mm socket, a pair of needle nose pliers, some Dawn dish soap for cleaning the filters, some filter oil, a container to clean and oil the filters in, some paper towels, some WD-40. Some optional items are rubber gloves, pair of scissors, and a replacement filter. Alright, let's get started. I'll begin by removing the covers on either side of the bike using a Phillips head screwdriver. Next, using a 12mm socket, I'll remove the two flange head bolts holding the seat in place. Now, I can remove the seat by slowly wiggling it back and upward in a scooping motion. With the seat and the side panels removed, now I have full access to both the primary as well as the secondary air filters. I'll start with the primary air filter. The airbox cover is on the left side of the bike and is held on by 4 screws. Using a Phillips head screwdriver, I'll remove these. And then the cover comes right off. Looking inside the airbox, you can see the primary air filter on the left side, held in place by a plastic retainer clip. Down at the bottom of the airbox, there's a bit of pooled oil. The plastic retainer itself is secured by a screw, which I'll remove using a Phillips head screwdriver. Then, I remove the retainer. Followed by the air filter itself. I'm using an aftermarket air filter that I installed a couple of thousand miles ago to replace the stock Suzuki filter. But if you're running the factory filter, the same steps will apply, since the OEM filter is serviceable as well. With the primary air filter removed, I'll turn my attention to the secondary air filter. This sits on top of the airbox, right behind the gas tank. It's only held on by a hose clamp, which can be loosened and removed by hand. Now, with both air filters removed from the bike, I'll do a quick inspection. The reason the DR650 has 2 filters, to put it simply, is because the main or primary air filter filters the air needed by the engine, whereas the secondary air filter cleans the air needed for the proper operation of the carburetor. My primary filter seems to be in good condition overall, just dirty. The secondary air filter, on the other hand, is definitely overdue for a cleaning. I'll admit, I haven't looked at this one at all since owning the bike. I'm not exactly proud of that, but I'll make up for it today. Alright, time to disassemble the filters. The primary air filter is made up of foam stretched over a plastic cage that helps it maintain its shape. I start carefully peeling the foam away from the plastic frame. I find that it's easiest to start from the narrow end. Next, I move on to the secondary air filter. This one uses a plastic housing with the foam filter held between two retaining rings. Using a pair of needle nose pliers, I carefully grab the outer retaining ring by the edge and gently pull it out. I grab it by the edge because that's where it's the stiffest. Grabbing it in the middle can bend it and ruin the fitment. Mine still looks pretty good. Now, I have access to the actual foam filter inside, which I gently work out using the pliers. Alright, now I can move on to cleaning. I fill a bowl with lukewarm water, add some Dawn dish soap, and mix it all together. Then, I submerge the foam filter and begin gently squeezing it so it absorbs the water along with the degreaser. As I'm cleaning the foam, I make sure to squeeze it rather than wringing it out, since wringing can damage the foam material. The process itself is pretty simple. I submerge the filter under water and compress it repeatedly to draw in the soapy water. Then, I lift it out and squeeze the liquid back out, which helps release the old filter oil and dirt trapped inside the foam. You can actually see the yellow oily residue coming out of the filter. Once the water gets dirty, I replace it with fresh water and add some more soap, and repeat the process until no more dirt or oil comes out. After that, I stop adding soap and continue rinsing the filter in clean water until all remaining soap is removed. Then, I set the foam aside to dry. Next, I'll wash the primary filter cage, the secondary filter housing, and the retaining ring as well. Then, I repeat the same cleaning process with the secondary foam filter. Again, soap, squeeze, rinse, and repeat until the filter comes clean. After washing, I rub the foam filter in paper towels and gently squeeze out any remaining moisture. I do the same with the smaller secondary foam filter before setting both of them in front of a fan to dry completely. While the filters are drying, I'll turn my attention to the airbox. I start by soaking up the excess oil collected at the bottom of the airbox. There's actually a dedicated drain tube underneath the airbox, but instead of draining it externally this time, I decide to clean it manually. Some oil accumulation in the airbox is not unusual for a DR650. An excessive amount could mean an engine overfilled with oil, a previously over-oiled air filter, which I've been definitely guilty of in the past, or riding at high RPMs consistently like highway riding. In extreme cases, it could also indicate worn piston rings, causing blow-by. Once most of the oil is soaked up, I twist the paper towel into a thin strip and I feed it down into the drain tube to absorb any remaining oil and dirt. I just rotate it around inside the tube and let the paper towel wick everything up. Once I'm happy with that, I grab some WD-40 and paper towels and begin wiping down the inside of the walls of the airbox. Once the inside's clean, I move on to the snorkel where the air enters the airbox, making sure I wipe it down both inside and out. Then, I clean the outside of the snorkel on top of the airbox, and even run a paper towel through it to remove any remaining dirt. After that, I clean the secondary filter hose, along with the general area around the top of the bike, to help prevent dirt from recontaminating the freshly cleaned filters. I also notice a fair amount of dirt and sand around the sealing edge where the airbox cover meets the airbox itself. I definitely don't want that getting inside the airbox or into the threads for that matter, so I just clean those edges thoroughly as well. Next, I clean the plastic retainer that holds the primary filter against the intake screen. Lastly, I wipe down the airbox cover itself. One thing worth mentioning here is that the cover uses a removable foam gasket. If you remove it for cleaning, make sure not to twist it when reinstalling it. You want it seated evenly and flush inside the groove all the way around. I also inspect the 4 screws holding the airbox cover on, but they're still clean and in good shape, so I'll leave them alone. After about 8 hours of drying, the foam filters are completely dry to the touch. I squeeze them a few times just to make sure there's no moisture left inside. And yeah, they cleaned up pretty well. Same with the secondary filter. I'm pretty happy with the results. As I'm looking at the replacement secondary filter, I realize I'm not a big fan of the design. It's exposed foam on all sides, which is probably great for airflow, but since it sits under the seat, it also seems like it would collect dust and dirt pretty quickly. The stock setup uses a protective housing instead, so I decide to try a different approach. I've seen other DR650 owners cut a second foam filter to size and place it on top of the stock filter as a removable pre-filter of sorts, which makes future servicing much easier. From what I've been able to find, many open-cell polyurethane foam filters intended for small engines like lawnmowers seem to work reasonably well for this kind of DR650 pre-filter setup. But I don't have all that. I do have an aftermarket secondary air filter that I purchased years ago for my DR650, so that's what I'll use. I cut the top section off my replacement filter and discard the rest. The trim piece will sit on top of the stock secondary filter inside the housing. I will need to cut it to size, however. But before all that, I still need to oil the filter foam. I'm going to use rubber gloves for this, because it can get pretty messy. I take the primary filter foam and gradually work the filter oil into it, squeezing and massaging it into the foam until it's evenly saturated throughout, but not so much that it's leaking or dripping oil. Once I'm happy with the coverage, I stretch the foam back over the plastic cage. Next, I repeat the same process with the smaller secondary filter foam I just cut out. But if you're sticking with the stock secondary filter setup, this is where you would oil that filter instead. Now I can begin reassembling the secondary filter assembly. I insert the clean stock foam filter back into the housing and gently press it down until it sits evenly against the lower retaining ring. Then, I reinstall the outer retaining ring, carefully working it back into place until it sits flush against the foam filter. You'll usually hear or feel a small click once it's properly seated. Before inserting my makeshift secondary filter, I trim it down to roughly match the diameter of the housing. It doesn't need to be perfect, just close enough to seal against the walls without bulging excessively. Alright, that looks pretty good. I wipe away any excess oil from the outside of the housing, and now the filters are ready to go back in. I start with the primary filter. The airbox narrows towards the back, so the narrow end of the filter goes in first. Both the foam filter and the plastic cage have a center opening that needs to line up with the protrusion on the plastic retainer, so I make sure those are aligned properly. There's really no practical way to install both the filter and the retainer together as one assembly, so I install the filter first, followed by the retainer, and align everything up by feel. Then, I start the retaining screw by hand. Before tightening it down, I make sure the filter sits evenly and flush against the intake screen. Then, I tighten the retaining screw using a Phillips head screwdriver. I make sure the foam gasket is seated properly in its groove before reinstalling the airbox cover. Then, I reinstall the 4 screws and tighten them down evenly in a cross pattern. Now, it's time to reinstall the secondary air filter. I squeeze the hose clamp with my fingers, slide the secondary filter housing back into place, and release the clamp, making sure everything is seated securely. Then, I wipe away any excess filter oil that may have transferred onto the airbox during installation. Now, I'm ready to reinstall the seat. I slide it forward until it hooks into place in the front and settles down properly. Then, I reinstall the 2 flange head bolts using a 12mm socket. Finally, I reinstall both side panels using a Phillips head screwdriver. And with that, I conclude the process of servicing the primary and secondary air filters on a Suzuki DR650. I appreciate you following along with me. If you found this video useful or learned something, please consider liking and subscribing for more videos like this one. And I'll see you in the next one.